Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Vladen Neurotech.
Okay, welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Florian Solzbacher. And it's funny, again, some guests are people that, I just meet on the show. And then others like you, I think you have the record out of all 180 people that have been on the show so far. I think I've known you the longest. I took a class from you, I think in 2012, some nanotechnology class at University of Utah. And then I was working at Blackrock Microsystems as an intern. I don't think we were necessarily talking at that time, but yeah. Finally, pleasure to have you on the show. We've had Sherman Viba of Blackrock Microsystems. I talked to him in SFN of 2017. Nathan Copeland, of course, and Ian Burkhart, and then a former employee, Nick Halper, was on the show as well. So basically a good percentage of the show is about Blackrock Microsystems because it's one of the most important technologies, right? It's the only human approved implantable device. So finally, Dr. Solzbacher, thank you for coming on the show. This has been excellent. And I'm glad that our original interview date of April 1st didn't happen because you would have talked about your investment and I would have thought it was an April Fool's joke. But yeah, so since then, now in July 26th, you have some new news that you weren't able to share in April 1st. So anyway, sorry, this is a very long introduction. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation. It's been wonderful to see your efforts, both as an engineer, trying to work yourself on advancing the field, but then also playing a major role in communicating. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the interview.
Excellent. Thank you. I think the biggest question everybody has is you got a big investment round, and this is really exciting stuff amongst other people. Christian Angermayer, re.Mind Capital, Peter Thiel, which is the one I want to hear about. I think he's a very fascinating person. Tim Sievers, Sorenson Impact University Venture Funds. You got a round of $10 million. So do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Sure. So as you probably recall, what's been driving me, and I would say the entire team with Marcus as co-founder and partner, has been from the get-go developing solutions and technologies to help people with a focus on neurological disorders, people that have lost function due to injury, accidents, etc. And on our path to going there, we create Blackrock Microsystems, initially addressing the research market. And the motivation was actually fairly simple, that neither Marcus nor myself had a sort of a Warren Buffett in the family to sort of bankroll this. And when we started this, things like brain-computer interfaces and implantable chips to help people with tetraplegia, etc., did not seem to be a sustainable business proposition with much of a market behind it. And what was, however, clear to us very early on is that it's very important and that there's a pretty significant field out there of researchers, anywhere from basic fundamental neuroscience to very applied groups. And so we set off to say, why don't we try and enable them by providing them with tools? And if we're the Intel inside, it provides the electrodes, electronics, software, surgical tools, and they then make progress in epilepsy, Parkinson's, brain-computer interfaces, pain, depression, etc. The hope was that we would be pulled into those applications to then also help not only further the advancement of knowledge and understanding of these diseases and ways of helping them, but to then also possibly be the ones to build the clinical products. About 3 or 4 years ago, we then reached a point where two things happened. One is that we realized that we needed and wanted to make the next step to get some of those products going. The research market, of course, is somewhat limited in volume. There are a few thousand labs, I would say 500, 600, 700 that can really invest heavily. And it's been wonderful. They're great collaborators. And honestly, without them, we wouldn't be here today. It's allowed us to grow to the point to mature technologies with them together and get them to the point where they can be human ready. But as a company, if you really then want to go into that space properly, you need to be larger. And we recognize that. And at the same time, after having been in business by quite a few years then, we came to the attention of a number of larger medical device players, distributors and others that realized that the neuro devices market in general was becoming more interesting with more opportunities for products and treatments, and starting with Parkinson's and epilepsy and pain, auditory applications, etc. And so we ended up developing products and technologies for other players, which then by the end of 2019, early 2020, led to the situation of us saying, okay, we can no longer organically grow. We needed to find investors for that. And so that's what we did. We went out there and actually ended up with a number of groups that were very interested in jumping on board to help us build out what we call the neuro device business. And it is really a domain where we use some of what we've learned and some of the technologies to enable products that are technically in existing markets or in markets where larger players are already starting to gain traction. While doing that, we, of course, always talked about the fact that my original vision was to really carry the sort of things that we've been known for with the Utah Electrode Array, with our chronic implants in human subjects, to carry that out there into the real world. You no longer would have to be part of a multi-million-dollar study to get access to a device like the one that Nathan Copeland and others have had. But to make sure you can go to your doctor, it can get reimbursed. It's a procedure that you can undergo and use these maybe more niche or smaller scale applications in severe tetraplegia, in ALS, etc., as a starting point to get into the market and then use this platform to branch out into all sorts of neurological applications. One of the people that then got interested was Christian Angermayer, and with him together, the group that then included Peter Thiel with his investment group, which had realized that there's a massive opportunity in that field. Obviously, Elon Musk, with his investment into Neuralink, put things on the map where suddenly the financial market started recognizing maybe this is something that is important we should look at. And if you look back at the last 10 years, and in particular last 5 years, the volume and frequency of first in human demonstrations, of new innovation, of new capital, new companies starting, has continuously increased. So it's like a pulse width modulated type signal, and it becomes, you have the feeling you're at an inflection point now where people have recognized there is a lot we can do with that. And technologies had matured, largely in thanks also due to the collaborations that people have had with us and our devices, where suddenly it was no longer, this is too risky, you shouldn't implant anything that is penetrating. Well, you can, but there are no signals. That one was shown as being wrong. You can implant it, but it's not going to last long. Now we're past 7 years in several patients and past 9 or 10 years in primates. So step by step, you're de-risking the proposition and more people are buying in. And so that then creates a dynamic that, of course, is very different. And so this group then came in and said, and that was really wonderful for me as well, because the first thoughts and concept about this happened when I was in my late teenage years, over 30 years ago, when my mother at that time was working with disabled people and rehabilitation. And it just stunned me that I felt as an advanced nation how we couldn't offer them anything better than technically things that had existed for centuries, just a little fancified, like wheelchairs and maybe caring for them, but nothing advanced. And we then, in almost all the other investor conversations, there was interest for that topic, but it was more along the lines of, yeah, let's grow your neuro devices business. And then in 3 or 4 years, let's look at whether this brain-computer interface stuff really makes sense. Christian came in and said, yeah, this is wonderful you're doing that. We should, however, be accelerating the brain-computer interfaces. This is taking off now. We see this everywhere. And here are a few ideas for how we can grow this faster. And that's how we ended up coming together. It's the first time ever that I've interacted with, I think almost everybody loves the idea. It is emotionally very touching. And I think people are very much aware of the impact. But from a business point of view, it's been very hard to make a case for that. And that has changed partially through boundary conditions and then coming across a group like Christian and Peter's group who've said, no, the time is now and we should not slow down. We should not wait another 3 or 4 years. We have to do this now. How quickly can you do that? And recognizing the value and the vision within minutes of our first conversation. And that is what won me over. Then at that time, we had signable contracts from other parties on our desk. And Marcus and me had to sit down and say, what are we going to do? And I said, gut feeling, I think now's the time to take a risk and jump. And that's what we've done.
So are you saying then that they're not as interested in the prosthetic side of things, like the robot arm or something like this, but they really want to improve the bandwidth between consciousness and machines and basically being able to tweet with your brain?
No, I don't think that's what I said. I think they recognize the potential long term because there are so many diseases and disabilities. And obviously, any technology that you develop can have a number of different uses. And if this is the question of where you position yourself. I believe Neuralink positioned itself, at least for quite a while, as almost pushing in then into that enhancement direction. They seem to be coming back a little bit closer towards the clinical side. For me personally, my vision was always to help people that we have left behind and give them hope back and enable them, and realizing it's actually not so few people, it's quite a lot of people. And then if you go from, as I said, severe tetraplegia into depression and pain and all sorts of other areas where you can help as well, you're really recognizing a lot of people. Now, what you're touching upon, of course, is an important ethical question, and that is eventually you'll be able to do more with this. I think it is very important to share with people that there's a lot we can already do, where we can do a lot of meaningful restoration, all the way to sensory feedback, restoring speech, etc. But there are other areas where I'm very cautious to make sure people, the worst thing that can happen to this field is that this sort of Hollywood type hype and associated fear, people put chips into our brain and then they can read my thoughts. And as guys, we're right now, we can do amazing things, but we're like the Kitty Hawk with a Wright brothers. Look, it can fly 200 feet when it comes to these things. We are very far away. There's the number of connections in the brain and cells and things, and then making sense of that. I don't even know how to project that, how far out that is. Now, can we provide meaningful help? Absolutely. And so you have to be careful how you deal with it. We are putting together an ethics board, by the way. I'm not sure whether I'd mentioned that to you previously, because I want us, unlike the social media from the get-go, make sure we're aware of those questions. And eventually there may be able-bodied people that feel that that implant may give them an advantage or so, just like with every other technology. And society may be split. Some people may embrace it and run with it. Other people may bedevil it or be afraid of it. And I think it is important for us as a society to lay the foundations for how we want to deal with that. And I don't think we're necessarily, as a society, developed to the point where we know how to do that yet. All that we can do as engineers and people that want to help people is, to try and make sure that we start the discussion early and that we do it in such a way that we don't kill the field. Because the worst thing that could happen is, and very often every time there's press activity, there's always a small voice that people try to interpret, now you would want to enhance, or you want to make people better than they were before. To some extent, you could look at the Paralympics. There's some sprinters with sea legs that can run faster than an able-bodied person. How do you deal with this now? This was done to help that person and not, I don't think people are going to amputate their legs now to put prosthesis on. So I think it's justified to have that discussion, but I want us to be very careful to essentially not get into a direction where people connect that with these, as I said, Hollywood type movie connections where people fear things, and then the consequences that it could really damage an entire field. And then what do I say to somebody like Nathan who might promise, we'll make sure we'll get this. You can just go to a doctor to get it. So, and that is why you've asked the question, where are you positioned? 600 million people worldwide suffer from neurological disorders that could benefit from these things. That is huge. The economic impact alone dwarfs what cardiac disorders are causing. That is the opportunity. I think that is really relevant. That down the road, there's sort of the long-term vision, just like people that are working on going to Mars. The real return of that may be decades in the future. And that people invest into that right now because they feel it's the right thing. That is within everybody's individual brain and dreams and whatever. Not sure whether that helps answer that question.
That's really interesting. I think the possibilities are endless. We are at a very basic stage right now. We are the Kitty Hawk stage, but it can go pretty quickly. Like they went from Kitty Hawk to jet engines. It was only like 30 years or something like this. It was really fast, actually. But this is, of course, on a different cycle. But yeah, so actually, what do you plan to do with the money? Because $10 million is a lot of money, but at the same time, it's not a lot of money. That's like what you were saying. That's 2 studies, right?
It's the first step of several, obviously. And there was essentially a step to get us ready for that. But we are, as a group, fully prepared to go all the way. So we're clearly planning to bring our products to market. We've got obviously the brain-computer interfaces for severe tetraplegia and ALS that we would like to make available as soon as we can. And then there are applications, some of which are in the public domain by now, like the auditory nerve implants where we restore hearing. And beyond that, we have a pretty full pipeline of real, clear clinical products, that some of which have to go through the same kind of effort that all these implants go through, with the full studies leading to a PMA. And obviously, the associated investment volumes are significantly higher than the amount that was invested now.
Okay. Yeah, so this is the first of many potentially, and then with further successes, you'll be able to build on that and build up an inertia. So that is pretty wise. I do like that idea. So yeah, I'm curious actually. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit, and we talked to Sherman Viba. So he, of course, talked about the products that you guys offer, but I'm actually very interested in the history of the company, and because it wasn't always Blackrock Microsystems, the technology changed hands a little bit. So I'm curious to hear your history of the company and how it's progressed over the last few decades.
Gladly will. And it's often the case. Same with Apple, where people see how things took off after the iPhone. And the reality is they were very interesting a couple of decades before that, where the stock value wasn't terribly high. They were doing things, a lot of innovation happening. And then came that inflection point. And it's the same thing here. I mean, the reality is that the Utah Array that everybody's talking about, that one was invented by Dick Norman, one of my senior colleagues, friends, and mentors, who in the early mid-90s came up with a concept for that electrode originally for cortical visual. That was something that was driving him at that time. And when I was a student in my undergraduate studies and started looking into those opportunities, actually at that time working at a Fraunhofer Institute in Germany on biomedical engineering, on a parallel effort on the first generation of neural electrode when Thomas Stieglitz was there. He's another of the real heavyweights who's sitting in Freiburg at IMTech. A lot of electrodes that are being used go back to him. And I was actually his first student in that lab when he started. And so there are a lot of people that were involved. Dick Norman created bionic technologies in an effort to try and commercialize the Utah Array. At that time, they received some grant funding, a little bit of investor funding, but it was still very early. There were also a lot of technological challenges. All the full set of tools that were required hadn't been developed. And then as a next stage, John Donahue came around, also a very well-known figure that can be credited with having the courage of taking this out of the animal realm. Dick Norman worked in animals largely and kept trying to work on understanding things and improving things. But it was John Donahue who said, I'm going to take this first into primates and then I'll try it out. And he created Cyberkinetics Neurotechnologies out of Boston. They received quite a bit of venture capital in the, what was that, late 90s, early 2000s. And he then acquired Bionic, it was called Bionic Technologies, essentially this company, so that they could control the electrode array, which they saw as a key tool. They then demonstrated in the very, very first patient, Matt Nagel, to show that this could work. In parallel, I had joined the University of Utah after selling my first company in 2002. In 2003, I got an offer from the University of Utah, joined full-time in 2004, and reconnected with, this time on faculty, and we reviewed what the next steps would be. And so I ended up bringing a lot of my experience and knowledge on how to make micro machine devices work, systems integration, engineering, materials from my training and then my company experience. And we proposed to NIH a fully integrated neural interface, which used the Utah Electrode Array, a flip chip bonded ASIC on the back with wireless and all these other components, and won a competitive contract very shortly after having started. I didn't even have a fully equipped lab yet. So we're very lucky, but there were Daofeng Chen and Joe Pancrazio as program managers at NIH who gave us a chance, who gave me a chance and said, this is an interesting idea, we should do that. And so I took this array and we focused on making it more reproducible, making it more reliable, improving the materials, making it easier to manufacture it. Then we added the electronics. Reed Harrison was the one who developed the ASIC for it, and we developed an architecture. Fraunhofer helped with flip chip bonding. And so we started with that, and that led to a very large research program on the university side that was running at between $2 and $4 million at that time per year in expenditures, which again, for an individual PI at that time, I was a beginning assistant professor pre-tenure, was a pretty massive program. And by 2007, there were about 16 pending patents. And so I was faced again with a question of how do I get it out there? Because I'm an engineer, I'm not a scientist. So my real contributions are often not being the first one to come up with an idea, but usually being the first one who makes it work. And so I had to figure out how to translate it. And that's when I reconnected with Marcus, with whom I've had some past business experience. We also went to boarding school together in the UK and said, what are we going to do there? And part of it was me reaching out at that time, Tim Sievers, the president of Cyberkinetics, saying, Tim, I've got all these patents here. We've advanced the array and we've got electronics and a new ASIC. Is this something you would like to license and maybe work with? In parallel, I had discussions with Marcus about, do we have an alternative path? Do we want to create another company, etc.? And then these things, sometimes, I don't know, it's luck, circumstantial, I don't know. What happened is in 2007, the financial markets wobbled for the first time before the big crash. And so the conversation with Cyberkinetics went from, do you want to license that, to Florian, would you want to come on board as a director, helping us to restructure the company, to Florian, would you want to buy the company? In parallel, Marcus came back and said, we've both started companies. Couldn't we rather start with an existing team, buy something, and then build on top? And so he thought he was rid of me after for a little while. And then 2 weeks later, I was back at his door and said, I may have something here. What about we buy, and we didn't buy, for clarity, Cyberkinetics, but we bought the assets, which was those that we were interested in, which was technically what used to be Bionic Technology. So the Utah team with a small clean room, some equipment, I think 17 employees at that time. And so we acquired that, merged that with the patents and IP that I had, a pretty large contract volume that I was able to bring in, and then created Blackrock Microsystems with that idea of saying, let's go into the research market first. We needed to be cash flow positive quickly so that we would have the money to keep investing in the technologies and a little bit bide our time, because it was always clear to me that the field would take off. I had no idea when it would happen. And after all, it's taken sort of 13 years to get to that point. And so that's how we got there. So there's an entire history in it. So I've always said there've been a lot of people that have been involved that I'm very grateful for. And we've all contributed. I believe, that on the technical side, both my students and myself have been able to advance things quite a bit. We've now really reached a point where thinking about clinical products in earnest makes sense.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, get really good at the research side before moving to the clinical and really nail that first. So I think this is really inspiring. It sounds like you're doing the path that I want to do: engineering, science, business, and development. I don't know, what advice do you have for somebody like me, or maybe listeners who want to do not only science, not only neuroscience, but like kind of the whole enchilada?
I'd probably, to simplify it, but there are a lot of layers in there, and I'll explain that. Go back to a piece of advice that one of my senior mentors once gave me when I told him I would want to become a professor in this field, and then I want to start companies. And I asked him, what do I need to do to get there? And he hesitated a little bit. And there was actually Professor Reichel at the Fraunhofer Institute, Bavarian, very thoughtful, sly humor. And he looks at me and said, Mr. Solzbacher, you just have to want it. And at first, I was a little taken aback because I thought, yeah, of course I want it, but what am I actually supposed to be doing? But the bottom line is, and I've really fully only understood that much later. It eventually became clear to me, yes, I have to drive that forward. But in the end, you have to have the drive. It has to be a passion, and then you will find a way. Because very often in life, you will find that just when you need it, or all that you really need is one door opening at the right time that you can go through. And that's been the story of my life. I've always had to have a lot of balls in the air. I had to try out a lot of things. And that is what a lot of people tell you that have been successful. It's not about failing. It just, many of us just try so much more often and do all these things in parallel, sometimes in the hope that this will work. And sometimes our strategy works out. We have exactly the right key for the kind of right lock. And sometimes it's pure luck. It's circumstantial. Just we were very active. And one of the things that happened on the side turned out to be the important one that actually helped. Now, to make it a little bit more concrete, I think what you would want to do is, in your studies, of course, there are certain fundamentals that you should learn properly that will never go old. That's almost old school, your math, your physics, your chemistry, your materials. If that is solid, that one is great. Secondly, try to work in projects or interdisciplinary as soon as possible, because you have to speak the languages of other engineers, of clinicians, of business, of law, and they're different languages. And in the end, it is always your responsibility. Yes, you will need a patent lawyer to rephrase what you're doing, and then you're not going to recognize your own text anymore, and you wonder why this has to be so convoluted. But it's the same thing with the applications. You need to understand enough of the physiology, of the clinical side, to be able to help the surgeons, the caretakers, the users, the people that work with that, unlock the potential of what you're working on. And so the sooner you do that, I think the better it is. I also would recommend to start entrepreneurial activities early. Part of it has to do with the fact that the older you become, most of us eventually have families with responsibility, and we have a mortgage and kids and this and that. And I think it is very important that can and probably should be the pillar of your life, but it's also something that you do need to and want to invest time. And if you don't have it, you have to become a hermit and live all by yourself, which is great for some people, for others, not so much. Starting a company early means that you're doing it at an age where you can devote yourself fully towards that. And so my first business, for example, which I did when I was about 23, 24 or so, I was either working or doing sports. That was about it. And I loved it because I was turning what something I would do as a hobby anyways into my job. And then the same thing when I started here on faculty, you need to make sure it's something that you're really passionate about. And then the next thing that is important is you need to understand that you stand and fall with a team, build teams, build networks. In the end, very often when the going gets tough, it's up to you often to find the solutions. But again, you would never get there if you didn't have a great team of people supporting you in all areas. And then learning how to allow people to go their own path. You start recruiting your first team members, first maybe as your students, or then maybe in your company as a team. And you want to make sure you guide them so that they don't make major mistakes that damage their career or your business. But maybe they have other paths. And you need to allow them to take these paths and gain their own experience. And sometimes, the bigger the company becomes, the more often that happens, they may have a very different path towards a solution from what you would do. But hell, it could be a lot better. So there's all these aspects in there. It's a lot about communication. Very hard for an engineer. Since you're in communication, you've got a bit of an advantage. But I may not sound like it, but I was my entire childhood the geeky introvert kid that wasn't terribly popular unless you needed to copy homework or find solutions to a technical problem. And it wasn't until much later that I, out of necessity, learned how to speak in front of hundreds of thousands of people to make a case, to advocate for something. Because as an engineer, and that is important as an entrepreneur, by the way, it's also a great skill for an engineer in any case, even if you never want to start a company, but understanding how a business makes decisions, what drives the investments, understand how to make a case for what you want to do and how it benefits your customer, your user, your business, etc., is immensely important. So if you have the chance to participate in entrepreneurship classes while you do your engineering degree or your PhD, I would strongly recommend that. It just broadens your view, because as engineers, we tend to want to maximize the technical performance. But the reality is that as a business, you want to get it just right. Otherwise, you end up with these things that are so hopelessly over-engineered. And there are plenty of examples throughout history in many different areas. And we're never done. I'm never done. Whenever we release the product, I already have a long laundry list of things that we need to all fix and change. And I gladly have Marcus as a counterpoint who occasionally says, we are not doing this now. Stop fiddling with it. It goes out. It's a product. We start selling it, partially also because the best test is having it out in the field and then gaining that experience. And then, of course, you want to be aware of safety issues. Those are always paramount. But beyond that, it's okay if customers come back with things. Why don't you do this better? Why don't you do that? You collect that and you already have your input for the next generation. And it's more about quick turnaround. Are you responsive? And can you spin something new afterwards? And so that one you learn by doing project work early, doing internships, the kind of things that you've done, broaden your experience and make sure you don't just get tunnel vision and narrow yourself down because I'm a solid state background person, material. So I could theoretically go in and just focus on how do I make and etch materials and make the encapsulation last, etc. But I had to become a system engineer and understand how all the pieces together create an optimum, a global optimum, as opposed to a local minimum or maximum.
Yeah, definitely. Wearing lots of hats. And at the end of the day, yeah, you have to love it and not count the hours as you're doing it. I think this is great advice. Hopefully our listeners can take that to heart because I think it's excellent. Dr. Solzbacher, I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything that we didn't mention that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, just one thing. It's a big thank you I would like to send out there to all those of us who've worked with us, collaborated with us, students, faculty, colleagues, business collaborators, all those of you who've had the courage to explore new ideas with our tools, who come back with ideas for improvements. More and more of you are coming back also with technologies you maybe want us to help commercialize. I'm very grateful for that because this is not about me. It's not even about Blackrock as a company. It's about this entire field. And I think we're really at a watershed in this field. Neurological disorders, addressing them, the advances we can make there and how we can help people, I think is going to be the next big equally as big as going to the moon or Mars or whatever, with massive impact. And we can all be part of that. And so I'm grateful. I pledge that even after the investment, this will continue. It'll just put us in a better position to help each other. And I look forward to hopefully another 3 decades of doing this together, just in the hope that starting from next year on, we'll see more and more products see the light of day. And that's it.
Well, it's exciting stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing your booths again at SFN and you guys grabbing me and be like, oh, look at all these new products. And I think that'll be really cool.
Quite a few cool things coming up this year. Also some that I think people from, and it's not all clinical. It's something where I'm sometimes a little worried about. People feel, oh, now you're going to forget our research market. Hell no, we're not. We're there. And you're going to find a lot of innovation and hopefully benefit even from some of the other clinical things that may make some of the research easier. But we've got a treasure chest of things to show at SFN that I'm excited to then share.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Well, Dr. Solzbacher, this has been excellent. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Have a wonderful summer and a good start into the rest of the year. Stay healthy and safe.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.